Hello and good evening. It's now 19:05 in London. I'm Nikki Scott.
And I'm Luke Addison. Good to see you all. When we last were with you, we were joined by Dame Esther Ranson, who gave us a fantastic talk about her work as a tireless charity campaigner, TV broadcaster and journalist, and told us about her positive experience of lockdown by remembering how important it is to laugh, spend time with your family where you can, and obviously to look after your mental health. So it was fantastic. If you missed it, unfortunately, don't worry, because as always, you can catch up on that talk alongside all the other ones on demand, alongside over 20 events now available on the Rotary Great Britain and Ireland YouTube channel. The whole objective of Together Talks is to ultimately provide a resource library for anyone to use at any time for a virtual meeting to invite others, Rotarians and guests, into discussion to inspire action.
And tonight we're thrilled to be able to introduce you to Amanda Ellis, Director of Global Partnerships for Arizona State University's Global Futures Laboratory, which is part of the Julianne Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability. That's quite a role, but significant roles on such important topics are nothing new to Amanda. Previously as New Zealand's ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations in Geneva, as well as Prime Minister's special envoy, Amanda played a key role in New Zealand's successful UN Security Council bid. Other numerous roles also include lead specialist for poverty reduction and economic management for the World Bank and head of global gender group at the International Finance Corporation. Her significant work for services to women's economic empowerment has been recognized by the International Alliance for Women.
And Amanda's topic tonight is the critical role of gender equality in leadership. As number 5 of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, gender equality is such a primary issue for the betterment of humanity. It is about so much more than basic human rights. It is about the diversity dividend in the proven economic growth and prosperity of nations through the empowerment of women. So without further ado, let's learn a little bit more about Amanda through her introductory video.
Aloha from Hawaii. My name is Amanda Ellis, and I'm thrilled to be here with Together Talks. This is just a little personal intro, and Rotary is very dear to my heart. I was an exchange student many years ago, and it totally changed my life. It was the reason that I ended up coming here to Hawaii and had a scholarship to the East-West Center, which is where I met my husband, and we are now living again. By the time we connect, I will be back in Aotearoa, New Zealand, which is my homeland, and you can see behind me some images and some artifacts from there. But as I said, very, very grateful to Rotary for starting me on an international trajectory. I was very lucky to be New Zealand's ambassador to United Nations in Geneva, to run the development agency, and to also work for the World Bank and for the OECD as an economist. So thank you, Rotary, for really opening my eyes to all the incredible international opportunities and to why it's so important for us to have a globally connected world. So looking forward to Together Talks next week.
Not next week, tonight, right? Right, Luke, with fast forward time.
Super. Good evening, Amanda.
Kia ora from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and you can see I'm actually here. I'm day 2 of 14 days in quarantine.
Well, thank you for joining us all the way from across the world in New Zealand. I think you're just about our furthest traveled international guest. Close competition with Barry from the Bahamas, but I think you're winning. So let's move things along and offer you our Together Talks soapbox, please.
Well, 2020 was a landmark year for gender equality and the empowerment of women. It marked the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action, the 20th anniversary of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, the 10th anniversary of UN Women, and the 5th anniversary of the Sustainable Development Goal number 5, which deals with gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. So a very important year in which to take stock. How many countries have achieved gender equality with all those commitments? Well, unfortunately, the answer is 0. And only 8 countries to date, all of them in Europe except for Canada, have even legislated for full gender equality. So you can see we really do have a long way to go. And I'm hoping that today we can interact and talk about, as you said, Luke, not only the human rights dimension, which is a very obvious one, but also the diversity dividend, which is being increasingly recognized by the private sector in particular. So just thrilled to be here.
Thank you so much, Amanda. There's going to be so much to cover tonight. So we want to make sure we get as much into this conversation. But I think it would be lovely for everyone just to get a little bit of a sense of why you're so passionate about this subject. You mentioned in your introductory video that you had this kickstart to your career with Rotary and how wonderful that experience was as a youth exchange. But ironically, you couldn't join Rotary after that. Is that right?
That's true. That gives away my age. So yes, we did not allow women to join at that time. And actually, it was fascinating when I went back to join the foreign ministry after being at the East-West Center where I met my husband. And I was very excited to be appointed the International Secretariat to Pacific Economic Cooperation Conference. And this was the precursor to APEC, which many of you may have heard about, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation. And so it was back in 1988, and I was very excited because it was my opportunity to take notes at the first meeting. And my boss came across to me and said quietly, "I'm really sorry, but you won't be able to attend the meeting because it's being held at the Wellington Club." And I was like, I wonder what the Wellington Club is. And I said, "Really?" And he said, "Well, yes, you're a woman." And I thought, well, I know I'm a woman. What has that got to do with me not being able to take the notes? And then he explained that the Wellington Club was a male-only club. And I asked, well, won't we just change the venue? And he said, oh, it's the Americans who have invited us, and they're too powerful a country, so you just need to keep quiet. Well, those who know me know it's very difficult for me to keep quiet. So for about 3 months, I discussed this with friends and tossed and turned, and as I had nightmares about it at night. And in the end, I thought, well, honestly, this is just not fair. 1988, New Zealand was the first country where women won the right to vote back in 1893. And here we are in 1988, and not only can I not change the world as a young diplomatic trainee, but I can't even get into the meetings where they're talking about changing the world. So this is a bit of a story, actually. I then plucked up courage to approach the executive assistant of our secretary of the foreign ministry. And this was on the 13th floor, which was the top floor. And she looked very surprised. She said, "Amanda, diplomatic trainees don't usually come to the 13th floor." And I explained to her what had happened and the fact that I needed to resign because this wasn't in tune with my values. And she said, well, I'm going to make an exception. For the first time in my 47 years of working here, I'm going to make an appointment for you as a diplomatic trainee to see Secretary Norrish. But please don't tell him right away you're going to resign. He may have a solution for you. So a couple of days later, up I went again to the 13th floor with my little knees knocking, went in to see Mr. Norrish and told him about this situation. And he looked at me quizzically as though he didn't quite understand what the problem was. And so I then asked him if I had been Māori, which is our Indigenous people in New Zealand with whom there is a treaty of Waitangi. And in the 1980s, it was a real cultural renaissance to repair some of the wrongs that had been done to Māori. And I said to him, well, if I had been Māori, Mr. Norrish, would I have been stopped attending the meeting because of my ethnicity or the color of my skin? And that got him, that he understood. And he looked at the ceiling and looked at his feet and said, yes, Miss Ellis, now you put it that way, I do understand. And I propose writing to the Wellington Club to let them know that women are now joining the workforce in greater numbers. It is 1988 after all. And if they don't recognize that fact, they may lose much needed revenue. Would that be satisfactory? And of course, I didn't think that was very satisfactory at all, but it was certainly better than nothing. So I said, well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. And started to leave. And he then said, Miss Ellis, just before you go, I suggest that you may like to speak to some of the senior women about this issue. And so really there were two big takeaways for me. One is that we have to meet people where they are. And often the business case is what people understand. If you've never been discriminated against, as most white men have not, it can be very difficult to understand what it feels like. So you need to meet people where they are and speak in a language that they can understand. And the second one was really about the power of solidarity, because the senior women in the foreign ministry were amazing. We started a women's network, and the following year, we were very pleased to go and dine together at the newly gender equitable Wellington Club.
What a lovely end to the story.
Well, so I guess that's what started it all.
Well, that's going to ignite a lot of passion. And you did share that, you really wanted to get into systemic change after that. And I think the other thing, Amanda, from what you just said, is it's really so much more than a case of women's rights. It's an economic argument, right? Could you talk to us about that?
Absolutely. So my first economic role where this became really obvious was managing international development programs in Vietnam and going to a village where there was really extreme poverty. Back 50 years ago, Vietnam was among the poorest countries in the world. It's really had a very strong economic trajectory. But there were a group of women in a village who needed a $20 microloan to start a silk weaving business. And that was such a small amount of money for us in New Zealand. But going back to visit them a year later, it was just transformational. They had employed half of the women in the village. They had earned enough money to send their children to school, pay the school fees. It was really transformational. So that microfinance revolution that was really led by Professor Muhammad Yunus and the Grameen Bank, I saw up close and just how real that was. And later when I was working at Westpac Banking Corporation and had the opportunity to be the first national manager for women in business, we were looking at a range of surveys from our women customers, and extraordinary to see that 4 in 10 felt that they were discriminated against by the bank purely on the basis of gender. And as our CEO said, in a consumer-facing business, perception is reality. And how do we really fix this? So we set out at Westpac to be the bank of choice for women and to really turn that vision into action. And from a standing start, we went to over $500 million in new revenue directly attributable to my brilliant state managers in just 3 years. So that for me was another lesson in really what happens when you unleash the economic potential of women. And of course, that was in a developed country. A few years later, when I was working at the World Bank at the International Finance Corporation, which is the private sector arm, and I was working in Africa, it really struck me that it was not just attitudinal, but there were actual legal barriers against women. And there's still 1,669 laws that prevent women from being economically active on the same basis as men. So that really made me realize just how much work there was to be done to dismantle those laws. We have now done a number of studies at the macroeconomic level that show when there is a higher percentage of women who are active in the workforce, in the formal labor force, that correlates with a higher proportion of gender equality. So it's a virtuous cycle. And it's really been very interesting. We've just done a gender equality and governance index with the Global Governance Forum, which came out in 2020. And that actually very clearly showed the correlation between increased prosperity for nations and inclusive governance and higher gender equality. So at the micro level, at the macro level, we're really seeing that gender equality is not just smart economics, we used to say this at the World Bank, that gender equality is not just a human rights issue, gender equality is smart economics. And that was our mantra for the World Bank Gender Action Plan.
That's a huge point to make. Over to you, Luke. I know we've got lots of questions coming in, so over to you.
Super, thanks very much. So I spent a year in Vietnam from 2018 to 2019, one of my favorite countries in the world, but I won't go on too much about that, maybe for another time. But my very first question to you, Amanda, and certainly it's the question that I know that I should have asked a long, long time ago when I first started to become aware of gender issues overall. And really it's, what is gender? How is it defined and how is it different from sex? Why is it important that we learn that these are not interchangeable terms?
Such a great question, Luke. And we often talk about sex disaggregated data, which is measuring men and women. And gender is a social acculturation, which means that gender norms vary from country to country. You would have found it very different in Vietnam, for example, than in Zambia. So that distinction is one which many young people are now saying is too binary as well. We need to be looking at intersectionality and a much broader definition. We recently at the Julianne Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory at ASU hosted an international ideathon to look at the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and to look beyond that. And there was a fabulous group that looked at Sustainable Development Goal 5 and said, this doesn't reflect reality. This is very binary. What about LGBTQ? How do we really enlarge this debate to include everybody? And I think that's a wonderful point as well, noting the distinction between sex and gender, and then the intersectional issues, which have become so much more prevalent in recent years.
Brilliant. Yeah, really, really interesting. And something I wish I'd known, well, you to tell me a little while ago when I started my journey. My second question, just for me, is the sort of gender movements, equality movements overall, whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's gender equality, they suffer sometimes from the kind of counter argument of, in order to create a balance, power has to be kind of taken from one side to another. So with the kind of gender equality movement itself, how would you kind of explain to, in this instance, specifically men, that something like gender equality doesn't necessarily need to take any power from men to tip the balance? How is gender equality beneficial to men and all genders?
Another wonderful question, Luke. And we often think of a zero-sum game, but as you point out, it's actually not. It's about growing the pie, not slicing it up differently. And the research that we did at the World Bank really showed the positive intergenerational multiplier effect from empowering women so that there would be a level playing field. And the famous statement that Hillary Clinton made at the Beijing conference, the fourth World Conference on Women, is human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights. Mm-hmm. And actually knowing that there are so many laws that still impede women's ability to be economically active just makes no economic sense. So not only is gender equality better for women and children, we know that where there are higher levels of gender equality, more girls go to school, there's better family nutrition, and there's better intergenerational health. So there are so many studies now and such a lot of research that has been done to show this. Now, looking at boards, which is an area that really came to the forefront in 2008, when the Norwegian government said, progress has been way too slow, there's no excuse anymore, we need to have 40% women on boards or publicly listed companies will be delisted, which was quite an incentive. And everybody, where are we going to find enough women to serve on boards? And of course they did. And in fact, this is where the diversity dividend played out, and it was actually better for the economy as a whole. So very interesting to see too, where women are more likely to be able to become entrepreneurs, those economies do better. So it's definitely not a zero-sum game. It is better for everybody. Now, I think one of the interesting factors that you raise about the counter argument is that often those in power are not willing to cede power gracefully. And I think that was a lot of what we saw with the Black Lives Matter, which really shone a spotlight on racial injustice, not only in the US, but all around the world. And it was a very, very compelling movement. Now, the same is true for gender equality. And when we look at the way in which some governments are responding, I think it's very heartening. When you look at the Biden administration in the US, there are now 50% women, 50% men, and there's a predominance of people of color. So that's so exciting to see that kind of movement. And when we look at the data from the Interparliamentary Union, only 4% of parliaments around the world actually have a gender balance to date. And way back pre-2000, there was a commitment in ECOSOC, the United Nations Economic and Social Council, that we would reach parity by the year 2000. And here we are in 2021 with less than 4% of parliaments with gender equality. And that's part of the reason why people are now saying we need to change cultural norms. And to do that, we need to put quotas in place to shift things more quickly. The World Economic Forum, for example, estimates that it would take 270 years to reach parity in economic equality if we leave things as they are. So that's, a long time. And
Wow.
now, I could talk about this forever, so please interrupt me.
No, well, it's just
No, it's
questions, and yet it's so interesting what you're saying. But I'm going to combine a couple of questions, if I may, because there's a couple of them sort of come together. The first one is more than 90% of countries still have laws that discriminate against women and prevent them from being economically active. What can we do to change this? Which also fits in with another question from Elizabeth Gagnon ask how can we bring positive change to gender issue? And then there's a follow-up after you've taken those. So go ahead with those first, and then I'll follow up with something similar.
Well, this is really exciting because it's very difficult to make change when you don't have the data. And there is a program at the World Bank Group called Women, Business and the Law, run by a wonderful woman called Tia Trumbuk. And Tia and her team actually work across 190 countries to document all of the laws that impact women's ability to be economically active. And I think we might have some brilliant people entering that link in the chat if people would like to look at that. Now, just in the last year, we have been working on a project at the Julianne Wrigley Global Futures Lab to help everybody access this data. So we're going to put another link in the chat, which will allow people to click on a world map. And if you click on the country that you're interested in, be it the UK, be it New Zealand, be it Afghanistan, you will see a summary across a woman's life cycle and a score out of 100, 100 being perfect and 0 being terrible. So there's a little summary saying what reforms have been made recently, what reforms still need to be made, and you can scroll down to the bottom and get a listing by each of these life cycle summaries of the laws that still need to be changed. So we're super excited about that collaborative partnership with the World Bank Group. Then we now have one of our wonderful interns from Duke University who has worked with the UN Foundation Girl Up program, and they are just completing a toolkit, which we will share when it's ready, Nikki, completing a toolkit, which is an advocacy toolkit for youth to say, now's the time to go and advocate with your parliamentarian or your UN representative and tell them it's time for change. Now, I had not realized until I was ambassador to the Human Rights Council in Geneva that there is a global mechanism. Every single United Nations member country, so all 193, are examined every 3 to 5 years in the Human Rights Council, and it's called the Universal Periodic, which is quite a mouthful, or the UPR for short. But every single country has a public-facing examination of their laws. And so as a group of women ambassadors in Geneva, we would always make sure that we asked questions. And now with this new set of tools, we're going to be enabling everybody, everywhere, to have a mechanism to write to their parliamentarians. And the way we're doing that is through a sign-up mechanism. So if you're interested, you can click on the map, have a little look, and then you can go to a sign-up mechanism and say, please, a year out from this examination in the Human Rights Council, can you send me a little note with the latest data? And you will magically have that appear in your inbox, and you'll get a reminder at 6 months and 3 months. So we're really hoping that Rotary will join with us in this effort. As you know, Nikki, I'm a Rotarian at the Honolulu Club, and we're really hoping that this could be a worldwide movement, that the UN Foundation Girl Up, Rotary, and all other civil society groups can join to help make positive change.
Well, and I love that you're saying, of course, you know, Rotary is an army of people looking to make the world a better place, but there's so many partners that we work with, and these new NHS volunteers out in the communities that we're looking to come and join us. So everyone can play a part in this, and we're happy to play a role in that. Martin Lowe, the follow-up question, he said, what target would you set the wealthier countries that you consider they can achieve by 2025 to deliver gender equality? And I know this plays into a little bit where I actually was fortunate to see the map, and, you know, looking in at some countries that are more developed and they might say, of course, we've got no gender equality issues, but there are some that are less obvious, right? In terms of like hiring, around employment law, for example.
That's so true. And Martin, thank you for this question. Really spot on. I don't think there's any excuse for developed countries to not be at parity. And so changing the laws is a necessary but insufficient step. And Nikki, you mentioned employment law. There's still a lot of debate around maternity leave, paternity leave, and parental leave. And particularly with the pandemic, that has been really brought to the fore, where not only have women been those in the health front-facing line, most likely to be nurses, but also most likely to be those who are in the service professions. So when we look at the data points, what we would love to see is a realization that when children are learning online and women are also working at home, there needs to be an ability for flexible work, and women have been asking for that, and as have men, for quite some time. So the pandemic has really shone a spotlight on the ability for developed countries to work more flexibly, but also on the terrible digital divide, where developed countries need to be continuing their support to developing countries, because we're going to see what is called a K-shaped recovery, where the developed countries and the wealthier and the wealthiest people are actually getting wealthier, and those who are poorer and more disadvantaged and the developing countries are actually becoming poorer. So that's such a great question. And I think there's no excuse for the developed countries not to be reaching gender equality. And yes, Martin, let's say by 2025, and let's hold them to it.
Thank you. Over to you, Luke.
Super. Cool. So we only have about 5 minutes left, which is absolutely outrageous. It's crazy how quickly it goes. So like Nikki, I'm going to try and kind of combine a couple of questions just so we can get some good answers back. So we focused a lot on gender equality overall, a lot of the kind of work that you're doing, but it'd be lovely to know a little bit more about Amanda. So a couple of questions here. One of them is that you have a massive collection of earned titles on your CV. What has been your one highlight, and what is your aim for the future? And then just another question is around citing some of your heroes, such as Mary Curie, the suffragettes, Serena Williams. Who is your favorite heroine and inspirational leader?
Wow. I think being Prime Minister's Special Envoy to Francophone Africa was, for me, the most insightful, fulfilling role, because it was advocating for New Zealand's role on the United Nations Security Council. And many countries do not have an opportunity to serve. So we have a quite outmoded international governance system, in my perspective, where there's a permanent 5, and sorry, Britain, there's a permanent 5 members, and then there are 10 rotating seats. So really that's the part of the United Nations where there really is an ability to make a difference. So for me, Prime Minister Special Envoy to Francophone Africa, and because I love French, I speak French and have spent a lot of time living in the French territories, and wrote my master's thesis on a brilliant writer from Guadeloupe. And then in terms of heroines, wow, there are so many. For me, it would be the suffragettes, because it's just unconscionable that women couldn't have the right to vote, and still not in every country. I think the other thing we need to remember is that there has to be that intersectional lens. I was horrified to read just recently that the last state in the United States to let Native American women vote was New Mexico in 1965. So for me, the suffragettes, absolutely. And we have to remember too that I often would say New Zealand was the first country in the world where women were accorded the right to vote. And our former Minister for Women Affairs said to me, no, Amanda, they won the right to vote. They chained themselves to railings. They threw themselves under horses' hooves. They won the right to vote. And I think we need to remember that male allies are so critical in this struggle. So Luke, just thrilled to have you with Nikki today, because we know that we're not going to achieve gender equality or racial justice or environmental justice without all of us together.
Super. And obviously, your journey is far from over. So just a little question at the end of those ones as well is, what is your next step? What are your aims? What's next?
If you had told me a few years ago that I would be working with the world's nicest and most wonderful philanthropist, Julianne Wrigley, and at a university, I would have said you were mad. But I am just absolutely thrilled with the innovation at ASU. It's number 1 in the US, ahead of Stanford and MIT for the last 6 years in a row. And it has 3 very important elements to the charter, which I think should be our global charter. So inclusion is the first one. We judge ourselves not by who we exclude, but by who we include. And second is a real commitment to excellence. And third is use-inspired research, really making sure that we are active in the community and creating the kind of global partnerships that will solve the world's big problems. We have about 10 years left to save the planet, to believe scientists and youth, and I have now read the research and believe. So very exciting to see that the UK is leading now with COP26 and really going to make a big difference. And I hope to be there along with many others. But very exciting to see countries now who are on that same trajectory committed to net zero by 2050, and seeing that women are playing a very important role in the racial justice and climate justice movements, really at the forefront as well. So for me, that's the big focus.
Mm-hmm.
You know what, Amanda, it's amazing. I'm so glad we're having this discussion tonight, because we've just had one of our main leadership assembly across the globe, and our incoming president-elect, President Shekhar from India, is going to champion empowerment of girls. And so, you're giving us so many tools and ways that we can contribute as Rotarians and play a role. And I think just this whole conversation, obviously, is about diversity, equity, and inclusion. As you said, it's such a bigger conversation, isn't it, than it's the whole thing, and that unconscious bias that sometimes we don't see. I don't know if you've got a last comment to wrap up before we pass back to Luke, who then needs to draw it to
Actually, Nikki, that is such a great point. And when you look at the World Values Survey and the Reykjavik Index for Global Leadership, which really asks some pretty basic questions like, could a woman be head of state, or could a woman be CEO? And in some countries, for example, Russia, 7% of people believe that there could be a woman head of state. So there's a long way to go in terms of attitudes. And that's part of the reason why we do need some of these temporary and special measures as well. And we need all of us to be in this together.
Well, that's a wonderful way, I think, Luke. Over to you then.
Super. Yeah, well, so Amanda, thank you so much. I'm afraid we're out of time. It always goes so quickly. And as always, thousands of questions are left unasked, but now it's on us to try and find those answers ourselves. So thank you so much for joining us. And could I please ask you to now share your 3 key takeaways for us all to act on after we close tonight?
So, Nikki and Luke, thank you. An absolute pleasure. My first takeaway is how important it is for wonderful civil society groups like Rotary with global networks to be involved in advocating for positive change. So thrilled to hear about the focus for the coming year. Second, Sustainable Development Goals 17 for partnership. Partnerships are so critical. And that's my next takeaway. We can go fast if we go alone, but we can go far if we go together. And finally, be an upstander, not a bystander. We can all work together to make real positive change in our world.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Amanda. Those are great takeaways. And it's hard to say goodbye to you, but it is time. So thank you for sharing your wisdom. It's been an absolute joy. And hopefully, as you say, we can work together on all of that. So much to do. And it is interesting how the focus of Rotary, especially in this upcoming Rotary year, further on from this current year of opening opportunities, which of course is a wonderful year too. It's just amazing, this service, saving lives and serve to save lives, and how we can focus on empowering women and girls. So lots of work to do, clearly a lot ahead of us. So some very thought-provoking facts and insights that Amanda shared there too, for us to utilize, which would be fantastic. So let's hope that Amanda has an expedient experience in quarantine and gets out of that too soon, right, Luke?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, an absolutely brilliant talk, and a huge thank you again to Amanda and for all of you for listening. Very important conversation to be having right now. And obviously, as I mentioned at the beginning, the whole purpose of Together Talks isn't just to have one talk and then move on. You can share this talk as a resource. You can use it as inspiration to start some discussions. Why not have a meeting, run this talk and run some questions after it? Use it as a resource, and by all means get in touch with us to help you with that. So next time on Together Talks, we're delighted to welcome Peter Kyle, the director of Rotary International. Peter's talk will be entitled Peace Building, It's in Our DNA. It's going to showcase Rotary's peace initiatives and Rotary's historical role as a peace-building organization. Peter will highlight the partnership that Rotary has with the United Nations, that many of us may not have even been aware of, and our common goal to foster global harmony. So this is, like all of them, a talk not to be missed.
Absolutely. So let us end by thanking everyone who's here tonight as our audience, whether you're on the YouTube channel or whether you were here in the Zoom chat. And thank you for all the great questions. It just always amazes me how quickly time goes. But of course, that's okay, because we can share it again and it's available on YouTube, as Luke said. So please go to the YouTube channel, use it, and like, subscribe, and share. Until March the 2nd, then, it's good night from me.
And a good night from me.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.